Thank you, Adam. Now, if you think Adam has come a long way from Campbelltown, our next presenter has come all the way from Townsville. Mind you, we can't be too nice to him though, because he once told me that Sydney has pathetic coral compared to Queensland coral. In fairness, he's probably the best person to ask. Of course, I'm speaking of Dr. Peter Ridd.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's true. Sydney Harbour has not the most pathetic coral on Earth. That goes to Scotland, various other places, and a little bit of global warming would fix that quite well, actually. So I am going to talk a little bit about the Great Barrier Reef, and I actually don't need to say much more. This is a graph of the amount of coral on the Great Barrier Reef that's been measured since 1985. And you can see from that graph that we have record high coral on the Great Barrier Reef. Isn't that a wonderful thing? But what is just completely almost insane are those red dots you see there, because you see those last 4 red dots, they were the big bleaching events, right? 2016, up to 93% of the coral died. 2017, maybe, I don't know, 50%. More and more in 2020, and then 2022, all that coral had died. And remember, coral is a slow-growing organism. It takes 5 to 10 years for even the fastest-growing coral to recover, and we have record high coral cover. So I'll tell you what that proves. Prove that the reef is going to be fine forever. We've always got to look after it. But what it proves without any shadow of a doubt is that they deceived us on about how much of the coral had died. Now, you can see that dip there in about 2011. That was after a couple of really big cyclones go through, and one of those cyclones killed probably up to a third of the coral on the Great Barrier Reef, and it happened over 2 to 3 days as it tracked down the reef. They are the big killers of coral, and they cause these big cycles crashing down, but now we have record high coral cover. But this is not the only way that our beautiful Great Barrier Reef has been maligned by the scientists. And the bottom of a lot of our problems, not all of them, well, bottom of our problem are the institutions, the corruption of the institutions, but I'm going to talk about the corruption of the science institutions. So we also have our poor farmers up in North Queensland who are accused of killing the Great Barrier Reef by pesticides and fertiliser and all the other things that they put onto their land. And this is completely and utterly untrue. The water of the Great Barrier Reef, that's what it looks like. Does that look like a polluted wasteland? No, it does not. This is some of the most pure water on Earth, and the farmers are being blamed. This is up to 100 kilometres from the actual coast. Remember, the Great Barrier Reef is a long way away from the coast, and yet the farmers are blamed. When you actually look at the scientific data and take the measurements of the pesticides out on the Great Barrier Reef, it turns out that you can't even measure them. They're so low. And yet the farmers now have legislation against them, telling them they've got to do all sorts of things. And they're all being blamed for something that they haven't done. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, because we're talking about climate and energy, I want to talk a little bit about sea level rise. And one of the interesting things about sea level is that it does go up and down naturally with time. And it turns out that in northern Australia, partly because of the way the plate flexes, but also partly because sea level has naturally fallen over the last 5,000 years, that when the Egyptians were building pyramids, a lot of that you see in that picture would have been dry at low tide because the sea level has fallen by 1 metre. And when it does that, it kills a whole lot of coral. So we've actually got less coral now probably today than we had 5,000 years ago because the sea level falls. But you never hear about these sorts of things. And of course, we heard from Craig Kelly that the Pacific Islands, they're not shrinking, they're actually growing. This is well known. Coral islands grow because the coral grows, the bits get thrown up onto the beach, then the wind throws the bits up onto the sand dune and the islands actually grow, and this is actually what's happening. But the sea level is rising at the moment. It's been rising at almost exactly the same rate for 150 years. The sea level in Sydney Harbour, our longest record, has increased by about that much in a couple of hundred years. And we're supposed to be told that this is some disaster. But the interesting thing is that clearly, despite maybe people saying they believe all these disasters, they don't really, and you can tell by one very simple thing. Where are all the climate refugees in Sydney? Because what we should have is all those people who live on the foreshore of Sydney Harbour, you know, those beautiful mansions. Those properties should be underwater by now. They should all be loading their utes as climate refugees with all the belongings that they've still got left over, and their flooded house should be there in the ocean, and they should be all heading off to Penrith or somewhere where, you know, it'll take another 100 years for the sea level to get up to them. But they don't, do they? They still live there, and they're still there in their very wealthy places because the sea level isn't rising very fast. Even if it goes on at the present rate, and it's very slow in Sydney, it will take 500 years just to grow that much. This is not a disaster. And of course, we have all the climate thing. Craig mentioned that the deaths are down by 97%. Greenland isn't green yet. It used to be 1,000 years ago. That's what the Vikings called it. Food production is massively up. The Sahel in Central Australia is 15% greener than it was just 40 years ago. All this great news. And then we have another thing. We're at an energy forum. I want to talk a little bit about nuclear. In fact, before I got into trouble on talking about the Great Barrier Reef, I got into trouble up in North Queensland calling for a nuclear power station about 15 years ago, which was quite interesting. And one of the interesting things even then was the misinformation about nuclear power, which we heard from one of the other speakers. We have naturally a huge amount of radiation occurring, right? You're actually absorbing radiation from the Earth at this very instant. It's coming down in cosmic rays. I flew in from Townsville. I got a good dose of cosmic rays coming in. So the actual amount of extra radiation you get, even from a big disaster, is less than the natural radiation. So Fukushima, very little extra radiation. How many people do you think died in the Fukushima disaster? 1. They blew up 3 nuclear reactors. Those Japanese, they did the experiment properly, right? And we lost 1 person. Even Chernobyl, which was a really bad disaster, or a really bad reactor, only less than 100 people died. But you know where a lot more people died from that Chernobyl? It wasn't the nuclear reactor disaster itself. It was the dodgy science which then got out and said that this is dangerous to people even living in Germany. My host here in Sydney was living in Germany when the clouds went over. The real damage was done because there were literally thousands of unnecessary pregnancy terminations by scared women who thought their child was going to be maimed. And they never should have aborted those children. This is an example of where bad science and bad public policy kills more people, right? So we've killed far more people by the fear of nuclear radiation than nuclear radiation itself. And it's funny, it's one of the things which I always can tell whether somebody's fair income, if they really believe that we're going to end in a climate disaster, whether they really believe that the oceans will acidify and it will be so hot the only place that we might be able to live is down in Antarctica. You just ask them one question. Are you in favour of nuclear power? And if they say, oh no, we can't have that, well, that proves they're not fair income. Because if the world is going to end and Bangladesh is going to flood and all the Pacific Islands are going to go under, there's going to be billions of climate refugees, and you're really wondering about a bit of radiation, well, then that is pure madness. So at the bottom of the problem, what we have here is corruption in the institutions. I don't think I have to explain that. The scientific institutions, especially the environmental and science institutions, are utterly corrupt. And that diagram totally shows it. If there's only one thing I want you to take away from my talk, is that shows that we must have a quality assurance audit of all these major science institutions so that finally we can have some proper science coming out of it. and also tell your children that we have record high coral cover. Thanks very much.
God, he's a national treasure, isn't he, Peter Reed?